In 1889 Virginia, small towns lived and breathed on trust. Doctors were rare, hospitals even rarer, and survival depended on the skill and reliability of the few people who served the community's needs. Among them, none were more respected than the midwife. The midwife was not only the one who brought life into the world, but also the one who soothed fears, stitched wounds, and whispered encouragement to mothers during their most vulnerable moments. Martha Ellison was one of those midwives. To the people of her town, she was a woman of steady hands and calm eyes, a figure who walked quietly but left deep impressions in every household she entered. She carried a small satchel filled with herbs, clean cloth, and the tools of her trade, and when she appeared at a door, people breathed easier knowing help had arrived. For many women, especially the poor who could not afford doctors, Martha was more than a helper, she was hope itself. She knew the cries of pain, the trembling of fear, and the joy that came when the first wail of a newborn filled the air. Mothers often said, "If Martha is here, everything will be all right." And so trust grew, not just in her skill, but in her character. Yet trust, as history has shown us time and again, can be both a blessing and a curse. It can be a bridge to safety, but it can also blind us to dangers hidden behind familiar smiles. Behind Martha's calm face lay secrets too dark for most to imagine. She had learned long ago that her role gave her enormous power, not just over the beginning of life, but over decisions that mothers felt forced to make. At a time when having a child out of wedlock meant disgrace, when poverty crushed families, and when many husbands refused to welcome another mouth to feed, women came to her in desperation. Some wanted help to deliver safely. Others wanted solutions to what they called mistakes. And Martha, with her quiet nods and gentle assurances, became the one who decided what to do with the most fragile lives. But to the community, she remained a saint. She moved through the town with the dignity of a healer. Neighbors greeted her with warmth, children smiled when she walked by, and women whispered prayers of thanks for her presence. No one ever doubted her loyalty. No one dared to imagine that beneath her hands, which once cradled new life, there was a shadow that betrayed the very trust people placed in her. The irony of it all was that Martha wore trust like a cloak. She leaned into it, knowing that her reputation was her shield. A doctor might be questioned, a preacher might be challenged, but a midwife, she was untouchable. Women trusted her with their bodies, families trusted her with their legacies, and the community trusted her with its very future. And it was within that trust that she found the perfect hiding place for deeds too monstrous to name. This is what makes the story of Martha Ellison so haunting. Not only the deeds she committed, but the reminder of how easily people place their faith in those who appear to serve them selflessly. We want to believe in good. We want to trust those who offer a smile, a helping hand, or a comforting word. But blind trust can be dangerous. It can mask betrayal. It can cover the very evil we think we're safe from. And yet there is another lesson here. Trust itself is not the enemy. The real danger comes when trust is given without accountability, when silence replaces questions, and when fear prevents truth from being spoken. In Martha's case, the silence of the women who suspected something was wrong, the silence of the community who ignored whispers, and the silence of a society that shamed mothers into secrecy all wove together a cloak of protection for her. Trust without accountability is fragile. It is like a house built on sand, solid for a while, but destined to collapse. Martha's story is a chilling testament to this truth. Think of the mothers who lay exhausted on their beds, hearing Martha's words that their baby was born still. Think of the women who believed her promises that their child would be placed in a good home, never to see proof of that adoption. These mothers placed the deepest trust possible in her, because what else could they do? They had no alternatives, no resources, no power. They trusted because trust was all they had left, and in return, that trust was shattered in ways they would carry to their graves. The face of trust can look calm. It can look kind. It can even look holy, like Martha walking through the streets with her satchel of healing herbs. But the lesson we carry from this part of her story is clear. Trust must never silence truth. Trust must never excuse accountability. We must ask questions, we must demand honesty, and we must never allow appearances to blind us to reality. Today, the story of Martha Ellison remains buried in whispers of history. But its message reaches us even now. Never underestimate the weight of the trust you give away. Guard it carefully, place it wisely, and when you carry trust from others, know that it is a sacred gift, not a shield for wrongdoing, but a responsibility to protect life and dignity. In the quiet face of Martha Ellison, the community of 1,889 Virginia saw a healer, a savior, a friend. But history tells us they were deceived. And if we learn nothing else from their story, let us learn this. Trust is powerful, but without truth, it becomes a mask, and behind that mask, evil can hide in plain sight. The church bell rang every Sunday in the small Virginia town, its chime echoing across the rolling hills and quiet farms. To many, it was the sound of hope, of salvation, of community. But beneath that very church, beneath the creaking wooden floors where families gathered to pray, a different story was being written, one not of light but of shadows. It was the story of desperation, of choices made in fear, and of the lives of the most vulnerable snuffed out before they had even begun. The midwife at the center of it all, Miss Eleanor Mayfield, was trusted by nearly every household in the county. With her weathered hands, calm voice, and years of experience, she was often the first face a newborn saw and the last voice a struggling mother heard before relief. Outwardly, she was a figure of compassion. But behind that mask of gentleness was a woman who had grown hardened by years of witnessing the silent tragedies of poverty, abandonment, and despair. In the late 1800s, Virginia was no easy place for the poor. Farms failed, fathers left, and mothers carried the crushing weight of children they could not feed. Shame was a heavy yoke in those days, especially for unmarried women. A pregnancy out of wedlock was not only scandalous, it could ruin a family's name forever. Many young women, trembling and desperate, came to Eleanor not for help in giving life, but for help in hiding it. Eleanor found herself facing a terrible choice, one that over time became a dark pattern. Instead of guiding those newborns into the world to live, she began quietly erasing them from it. At first, it may have seemed like mercy, a way to save the mother from shame, to prevent another hungry mouth in a household already scraping by. But mercy twisted into habit and habit into horror. The church itself became her hiding place. After each service, when the congregation had gone home, she lingered. She knew the boards beneath the pulpit creaked just enough to conceal what lay below. One by one, the tiny bodies were lowered into the earth beneath the floorboards, sealed away beneath the very house of God, where people came to sing hymns of forgiveness and grace. Why there? Perhaps she thought the church would keep them safe. Perhaps she thought burying them beneath sacred ground gave their brief lives a semblance of dignity. Or perhaps the irony of hiding sin beneath holiness was a weight too heavy for her to truly comprehend. The shadows of desperation did not belong only to Eleanor. They belonged to the mothers who came to her door at night, cloaked in shawls, faces streaked with tears. They belonged to the fathers who turned away, refusing to acknowledge the lives they had created. They belonged to a society that chose to shame and punish instead of protect and support. Eleanor may have carried out the acts, but the silence of an entire community made it possible. Week after week, life in the town went on. Babies were born, crops were harvested, weddings celebrated, funerals mourned. But beneath the surface of ordinary life, beneath the floor of the church where townsfolk knelt in prayer, there grew a hidden graveyard of infants who never knew laughter, sunlight, or a mother's embrace. The congregation sang hymns above them, unaware that their voices floated over the muffled silence of so many little souls. Desperation is a dangerous thing. It twists the heart and clouds the mind. It convinces people that sin is solution, that silence is protection, and that concealment is safety. For Eleanor, desperation turned her from healer to harbinger of death. For the mothers, desperation silenced their cries and shackled their choices. And for the community, desperation allowed them to ignore what they must have on some level sensed. The tragedy is not just that lives were lost, but that they were lost unseen, unloved, and unacknowledged. To this day, the story of those children beneath the church floor stands as a haunting reminder of what happens when shame rules over compassion, and when fear becomes stronger than hope. But within the shadows of this desperation lies a lesson that still speaks across time. No one should ever be left so hopeless that they believe death is mercy. No mother should be forced into silence, no child should be hidden in the earth, and no community should close its eyes to suffering. The church still stands in Virginia, weathered and old, a relic of another age. The floorboards creak just the same, and the walls still echo with the memory of hymns. But for those who know its buried secret, its shadow is darker, its silence heavier. And yet, even in the horror, the lesson remains. Desperation breeds destruction, but compassion can break the cycle. Eleanor's story is not one of a monster, but of a woman consumed by shadows she could not escape. And perhaps, if we look closely, we see the reflection of those same shadows in our own time, in the hidden corners where the desperate still suffer in silence, waiting for someone to choose love over shame and courage over fear. Old wood has a memory. Every step across it carries not just the sound of feet, but the echo of those who walked before. The floorboards of the church in that Virginia town creaked with the weight of decades of worshippers. Farmers with calloused hands, mothers carrying children, widows clutching worn Bibles. To most, those wooden planks were nothing more than a surface on which they knelt and prayed. But to Miss Eleanor Mayfield, the midwife whose secrets ran deeper than her prayers, the floorboards were not just wood. They were a threshold between the living and the dead. Each Sunday, as the congregation filled the pews, the air hummed with hymns of redemption and salvation. The preacher's voice rose and fell, proclaiming forgiveness, grace, and eternal life. But below, beneath the very boards that bore the weight of their devotion, lay silence, an unmarked graveyard of infants whose cries had been stilled before they could reach the ears of heaven. At first, Eleanor had not chosen the church floor as a burial ground. She had considered fields, woods, even shallow graves behind barns where no one would wander. But each option felt unsafe, too exposed. It was almost by accident that she discovered the hollow beneath the pulpit, an unfinished crawl space where the earth was soft, hidden from sight. The church, she reasoned, was sacred. Perhaps in her twisted logic, burying the infants beneath holy ground gave them dignity, even in death. The first time she pried up those boards, her hands trembled. The wood groaned as though protesting, as though it knew it was about to bear a burden heavier than the weight of worshippers. She dug into the damp earth with quiet desperation, lowered the tiny form wrapped in cloth, and sealed the boards shut. When the congregation returned the next morning, none suspected that beneath their feet lay the body of a child. But once the first had been hidden there, the decision became easier. The floorboards turned into her confessional, her graveyard, her silent accomplice. Every creak of the wood became a reminder of what she had done, but also a reassurance that her secret was safe. Over the years, those floorboards absorbed more than just the sound of footsteps. They absorbed guilt. They absorbed prayers whispered by mothers who had come to Eleanor in desperation. They absorbed the weight of silence, for no one dared ask too many questions when a child vanished quietly into the night. The congregation sang louder, perhaps to drown out the uneasy feeling that lingered in the air. But wood is never truly silent. It remembers, it ages, it betrays. Parishioners noticed from time to time that the boards near the pulpit seemed softer, sagging under unseen strain. They chalked it up to moisture, to the passing of years, to neglect. And no one suspected that the earth beneath was slowly filling with the remains of children who had never been baptized, never been named, never been mourned in the open. Eleanor herself often lingered after services. She would sit in the last pew, her hands folded tightly, her eyes fixed on the pulpit floor. While others prayed for forgiveness, she wrestled with her own kind of prayer, a plea that her secret remain hidden. Each hymn seemed to accuse her, each sermon on judgment weighed heavier on her chest, and yet she never stopped. The floor had become both her punishment and her refuge. To her, those boards symbolized both shame and mercy. Shame because she knew she was burying the evidence of sin where people sought God's presence. Mercy because she believed, however wrongly, that the church gave the children a resting place holier than any shallow grave in the woods. It was a paradox that only deepened her torment, and yet the floorboards never told their story. They endured decades of footsteps, of sermons, of weddings and funerals. They carried the weight of the living while sheltering the truth of the dead. Every nail driven into them, every polish of wax, was a layer of concealment over what lay beneath. The tragedy of the church floorboards is not just the children they covered, but the blindness of the community above them. How many times did mothers weep in prayer above the very spot where their hidden child lay? How many fathers, in their silence and denial, knelt to ask for blessings, while the consequence of their actions rested only inches below their knees? The church became a stage where faith and hypocrisy coexisted, divided only by planks of wood. Over time, the whispers grew: a child gone missing here, a strange disappearance there. Some suspected Eleanor, but trust in her reputation as a midwife was too strong to break. Others suspected the women themselves, blaming shame, blaming sin, blaming anything but the possibility that beneath their beloved church, the earth itself had become a coffin. The floorboards of the church still creak today. Tourists, historians, and wanderers tread the same path where once hymns drowned out the silence below. Some say the boards groan louder in the stillness of night, as if releasing the weight they carried for so long. Others swear that, if you listen closely during prayer, you can hear not only the echo of voices above, but also the faintest whisper of cries that were never heard. Those boards remind us of something deeper, that secrets, no matter how well hidden, leave marks on the world. The wood bore the guilt of Eleanor Mayfield, but it also bore the indifference of a society that drove women to desperation. Each creak was a testimony to choices forced by shame, by fear, by poverty. In the end, the floorboards of the church were not merely wood. They were witnesses. They were keepers of stories the town refused to tell, and they remain a haunting symbol of how easily innocence can be buried, not only beneath earth and timber, but beneath silence and denial. For as long as that church stands, the boards will creak underfoot, and with each step they will whisper the truth, that the ground beneath them once held the weight of desperation, and that no hymn can fully drown out the cries of the forgotten. The little town in Virginia prided itself on being a place where everyone knew one another. Life was slow, quiet, and governed by routines: Sunday church gatherings, weekly markets, and family dinners that rarely changed from one season to the next. But beneath this quiet rhythm of life, an unease began to grow. It was not loud, not obvious, but like the faint creak of floorboards in a silent house, it was enough to unsettle those who paid attention. For years, the midwife, a woman named Eliza, had been the figure people called upon in moments of both joy and crisis. She held newborns in her hands before their mothers could, and she had sat silently with families who lost their infants before they ever had the chance to cry. She had become both a trusted healer and an unavoidable shadow in the lives of the townsfolk. To the eyes of many, she was indispensable, yet to others, something about her presence had begun to feel heavy, as though she carried secrets too deep for words. It started with whispers among women in the town. "Have you noticed?" One would murmur while washing laundry by the river. "How many babies Eliza delivers that never see the next sunrise?" Another would nod, reluctant to speak but unable to silence the unease she felt. Babies had always been fragile in that time. Disease, poor nutrition, and limited medical knowledge often took them, but this seemed different. It was not just the frequency of loss, but the strange quietness with which Eliza accepted it, never seeming surprised, never grieving alongside the mothers. By the late 1880s, the murmurs had grown into hushed conversations that people only dared to have behind closed doors. Families who had lost infants began to recall odd details. Eliza insisting that she alone handle the newborn first, or discouraging mothers from immediately holding their children after birth. Some remembered how she often carried the child into another room before anyone else could lay eyes on it. They hadn't questioned it then. They trusted her knowledge, her experience, her authority. But now, in hindsight, the memories began to haunt them. The church, the most sacred place in town, became another center of suspicion. Its floorboards had always creaked oddly, and the air inside often carried a damp, earthy smell. People dismissed it as the scent of old wood and moisture from the nearby river. But children who played too close to the altar sometimes whispered that they heard strange hollow sounds beneath the planks, as if the ground itself were filled with echoes. When they spoke of it to their parents, they were silenced quickly. "Don't say such things in God's house," the adults scolded, but even those adults began to wonder privately why the midwife lingered there so often, long after services were done, long after the congregation had gone home. Still, no one dared to accuse her directly. To confront Eliza was to confront their own trust, to admit that for years they had placed their children, their very lives, into the hands of someone who might not have been what she seemed. Denial, in many ways, was easier than facing such a possibility, but denial cannot stand forever. One Sunday, after yet another infant's funeral, the third in as many months, a group of mothers stood together at the churchyard. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow, but their grief carried with it a quiet determination. "We can't keep pretending," one of them said softly. "Something is wrong, something we're not seeing." Her words hung in the air like a heavy fog. Others nodded reluctantly. They were afraid of being wrong, afraid of speaking ill against someone so established in the community. But they were more afraid of what silence might mean for the next child and the next. Soon the whispers reached the ears of men in the town, men who prided themselves on reason and strength. At first, they dismissed the concerns as hysteria, the worries of grieving women who sought someone to blame for the fragility of life. But as more stories surfaced, similar details, similar patterns, the men too began to grow uneasy. One farmer recalled how Eliza had told his wife not to check on their newborn until morning, only for the baby to be found lifeless at dawn. Another father remembered the faint sound of hammering inside the church one evening, long after service had ended. He had thought little of it then, assuming the pastor was making repairs. Now, in hindsight, it gnawed at him. What had once been scattered suspicions began to take shape like pieces of a puzzle reluctantly forced together. Still, no one wanted to be the first to accuse her. The risk of slandering a respected midwife was too great, the shame of being wrong unbearable. So the town remained trapped between fear and doubt, the whispers growing louder but never quite breaking into open accusation. It was the children, again, who nearly forced the truth into the light. A group of them, chasing one another through the churchyard, began tapping on the wooden floorboards inside the sanctuary. The hollow thud beneath their feet startled them, and one dared to peel up a loose plank. What they saw was only a glimpse, dark soil disturbed, a faint smell of decay rising from below, but it was enough to send them screaming to their parents. The adults brushed it off, scolding the children for their imagination, but in the privacy of their minds they wondered, what if the children weren't wrong by then? Eliza herself seemed to sense the change in the air. Her once commanding presence had become more withdrawn, her eyes darting too quickly, her words carrying less conviction. She avoided the questions of mothers, and when infants died, she offered no explanations, only silence. In that silence, suspicion became almost unbearable. The whispers were no longer just whispers, they were questions, they were doubts, and soon they would be demands for truth. The church in Virginia stood as a sanctuary of prayer, its wooden beams reaching toward heaven, its bell echoing across the countryside every Sunday morning. For decades, families had come to kneel beneath its roof, believing it to be the safest place for their souls. Yet, beneath that same floor, hidden under planks walked upon by countless feet, lay a truth too horrific to imagine, a graveyard of silence. The day the floorboards of the church were lifted, the town would never be the same again. It began not with suspicion of crime, but with the natural wear of time. The church, built in the late 1700s, had aged gracefully, but by the late 1880s, repairs were inevitable. The boards creaked more loudly, and some planks showed signs of rot. The elders of the congregation gathered one morning to discuss renovations, deciding that before winter came, the church floor must be replaced. None of them could have foreseen that the repair would become an excavation of the town's darkest secret. As carpenters began their work, the smell was the first thing that met them. At first, they dismissed it as mold or dampness. But when the first few planks were pried open, a thick, suffocating odor rose from beneath, a scent of decay, old and clinging. One of the workers gagged, clutching his shirt to his face, while another dropped his tools in fear. The air that escaped from beneath the church floor wasn't simply old dust. It was the stench of death. They thought it might be animals, rats perhaps, or stray dogs and cats that had crawled into the church's foundations. Yet as they peered into the darkness below, their lanterns revealed not animals but bones. Small bones, fragile, delicate, unmistakably human. A silence fell over the workers as realization struck. These were not beasts, these were babies. Word spread quickly. Within hours, the churchyard filled with townsfolk, whispering in disbelief. Men who had been baptized there, women who had walked down the aisle to Mary, elders who had prayed every week, all stood around the church with horror etched into their faces. The discovery was too large to contain. Lanterns were lowered deeper beneath the floor, and what they revealed was a sight that would scar the memory of every witness. Rows upon rows of tiny skeletons piled together, some wrapped in fragments of decayed cloth, others bare and brittle. Dozens upon dozens, hundreds as the excavation continued. The town's sheriff was called, his hands trembling as he counted. He could not give an exact number, there were too many. Some of the bones were so entangled, so fragile, that they crumbled at a touch. Mothers clutched their own children tightly to their chests, as if the embrace could shield them from the reality that these bones once belonged to little ones whose cries were never heard. The question that rang through every heart was the same: who could do this? And as whispers turned into accusations, one name kept returning: the midwife. For years, she had been a trusted figure, a woman summoned in the dead of night when a mother's cries of labor echoed through wooden cabins and farmhouses. She was always there, calm, competent, carrying her satchel of herbs and instruments. Many women owed their survival to her, but others, particularly unmarried women or poor mothers with too many mouths to feed, had whispered that she took care of babies who weren't wanted. Some dismissed it as rumor, a cruel slander against a woman doing difficult work. But now, standing over the graves beneath the church, those whispers returned with terrible clarity. The midwife had vanished months before the discovery, having left town under vague circumstances. Some said she had gone to live with distant relatives, others claimed she had simply disappeared, but with the truth unearthed beneath the church, her absence became damning. She had hidden the evidence of her deeds where no one thought to look, beneath the very place people went to confess their sins. The excavation went on for days, with townsfolk and officials alike working with grim determination to bring each tiny body into the light. They laid them out respectfully, one by one, lining the churchyard with rows of small white coffins made hastily from pine. A preacher prayed over them, his voice breaking as he tried to find words that could carry such sorrow. But no words seemed sufficient. The ground outside became a mass grave consecrated with tears, as hundreds of unnamed babies were finally given a burial worthy of human dignity. The unearthed tragedy was not just about one woman's deeds, it was a mirror to society itself. How had so many turned blind eyes? How many mothers had been too afraid to speak, too desperate to resist? How could such horror grow beneath the very floor where the community gathered each week? These questions haunted every heart in Virginia. For the survivors, the unearthed bones became a reminder of what happens when silence prevails over truth, when shame outweighs compassion, when desperation goes unanswered by mercy. The church itself became a symbol, not of faith alone, but of the danger of hidden sins. No sermon preached there afterward could escape the weight of what had been discovered beneath. The unearthed truth changed people. Women began to speak more openly of their struggles. Neighbors became more watchful, not only of each other, but of those suffering in silence. And above all, the lesson lingered, that secrets, no matter how deeply buried, will one day come to light. The earth itself will not hold them forever. The midwife was never found, her fate swallowed by history. But the babies she buried were no longer hidden. Their unearthed remains spoke louder than any confession she could have given. They told a story of suffering, of silence, and of the desperate need for compassion in a world that too often ignored the cries of the weakest. And in that haunting discovery, the townspeople vowed never to let such silence reign again. History has a cruel way of reminding us of the mistakes humanity is capable of making, and the story of the midwife in Virginia is one such haunting reminder. What seemed like trust, compassion, and care turned into betrayal, death, and sorrow. Yet within this darkness, lessons rise to the surface like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The tragedy of those hidden children beneath the church floorboards is not just a tale of horror. It is a message etched into time, teaching us about vigilance, empathy, and the weight of silence. The first lesson is simple but profound. Blind trust can be dangerous. The women who sought the midwife's help were vulnerable. Many were young, unmarried, or caught in circumstances where having a child would bring them shame or ruin in their communities. They trusted her because she carried the title of midwife, a position that implied safety and care. But titles, as this story reveals, do not always represent truth. It is a warning to us even today, whether in personal life, politics, or relationships, that we must measure people not by the masks they wear, but by the fruit of their actions. Trust should be earned, not blindly given. The second lesson is about the weight of desperation. These mothers were not evil. They were frightened, silenced by society, and often cornered by families who refused to understand their struggles. In their desperation, they sought what looked like an answer but turned into a trap. Their voices were muted by shame, and their silence allowed the midwife to continue her horror unchecked. This reminds us that silence, born of fear or stigma, can sometimes do more harm than good. When people are too afraid to speak, injustice thrives in the shadows. Another sobering lesson is the danger of hidden sins within sacred spaces. The church, meant to be a sanctuary of safety, became the graveyard of innocence. It's a symbol of how evil can sometimes hide behind institutions meant for good. This doesn't mean faith itself is corrupted, but it warns us that even sacred places can be exploited when vigilance is absent. We must never assume that goodness is automatic. It must be protected, guarded, and kept accountable. Blind reverence without oversight can create spaces where unspeakable crimes go unnoticed. There is also the lesson of courage versus cowardice. Whispers and suspicions filled the town long before the truth was unearthed. People heard things, noticed things, and yet chose silence. Some feared being wrong, others feared scandal, and many simply thought it was not their place to interfere. Their inaction allowed the midwife to continue her gruesome acts for years. The truth is painful. Silence can be a form of complicity. The courage to speak, even when unpopular or risky, could save lives. This lesson challenges us today. When we see wrongdoing, are we brave enough to speak, or do we, like the villagers, hide behind silence? Perhaps the most heartbreaking lesson is about the value of life itself. Each child beneath those floorboards was more than a secret. They were futures cut short, voices never heard, laughter never shared. Their lives remind us of the fragility of existence and the cost of neglect. In a world where life is often devalued, whether through violence, indifference, or systems that fail the vulnerable, the story forces us to reflect. Do we treat life with the reverence it deserves, or do we, too, sometimes turn away? But in the shadows of pain, there is also the light of responsibility for future generations. The unearthing of the truth shocked the community into awareness. It taught them the need for accountability, for oversight, and for compassion that does not judge but supports. Mothers should not have to fear shame to the point of hiding their pregnancies. Communities must create spaces where vulnerability is met with kindness, not condemnation. If such a culture had existed in Virginia in 1889, perhaps fewer women would have turned to the midwife in desperation. And then there is one final, enduring lesson. Darkness cannot remain hidden forever. No matter how carefully secrets are buried, the truth will find its way to the surface. The church floorboards could not conceal the weight of hundreds of innocent souls. Time itself became a witness, and when the boards were lifted, the truth demanded recognition. This serves as both a warning and a comfort. Evil, no matter how well hidden, will eventually be revealed. For those who live honestly, this is a comfort. For those who live in deceit, it is a warning. So, what do we carry from this tragedy? That trust must be tested, that silence must be broken, that sacred spaces must remain accountable, that courage must outweigh fear, and that every life, no matter how small, holds immeasurable value. The story of the midwife is a grim echo of history, but it is also a mirror, asking us what we will do differently in our time. Will we choose vigilance over complacency, compassion over judgment, and truth over silence? In the end, those children's lives, though stolen, are not forgotten. Their story, carved in pain, becomes a guide for us, a call to protect, to speak, to see, and to act. Their silent cries echo across generations, urging us not to repeat the same mistakes. From the shadows of the past, we are handed a responsibility to honor life, to expose evil, and to ensure that what hides in the dark is always brought into the light.